Greetings and welcome back to the Archives. I am the Archivist, and tonight we delve into a story that begins in the quiet, comforting heart of suburbia, only to unravel into a labyrinth of secrets so deep they threaten to swallow a family whole. It's a story about trust, deception, and the terrifying realization that the greatest strangers often wear the most familiar faces. It all started with a perfect family, a perfect babysitter, and a laptop that held a truth no one was prepared to uncover. The Miller family was the very picture of suburban bliss. David, a successful architect, and Sarah, a freelance graphic designer, had built a beautiful life for themselves and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, in a peaceful, tree-lined neighborhood. Their home was warm and filled with laughter, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and the scent of freshly cut grass hung in the air on summer evenings. Lily was their entire world, a bright, imaginative child with a fondness for fairy tales and drawing colorful pictures that covered the refrigerator door. With David's work demanding more travel and Sarah's projects piling up, they decided it was time to find a reliable babysitter. They were cautious, as any parent would be. They conducted thorough interviews, checked references, and ran background checks. And that's how they found Clara. On paper, Clara was perfect. She was a 20-year-old sociology student at the local university, with glowing references from 3 other families. She was polite, well-spoken, and during her interview, she connected with Lily instantly, getting down on the floor to play with her collection of animal figurines. She seemed responsible, mature, and genuinely kind. The Millers felt like they had hit the jackpot. They hired her on the spot, and for the first few months, everything was wonderful. Clara would arrive on time, her backpack filled with books and a friendly smile. Lily adored her. When David and Sarah came home, they would find the house tidy. Lily happily bathed and ready for bed, often with a new drawing to show them, a collaboration between her and Clara. The arrangement gave them the freedom they needed and the peace of mind that their daughter was in safe, capable hands. They trusted Clara completely. But trust is a fragile thing, and sometimes the most perfect facade hides the most unsettling truths. The change was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. It began with Lily's sleep. The little girl who once slept soundly through the night began to wake up crying, her small body trembling from nightmares she couldn't quite explain. She would talk about shadows and a sad girl in her dreams. Sarah and David chalked it up to a common childhood phase, comforting her with warm milk and promises that there were no monsters under her bed. But then, other things started to happen. Lily, who was usually a bubbly, chatty little girl, became quiet and withdrawn, especially on the days after Clara had been there. She would sit for hours, staring blankly at her toys, her usual creative spark seemingly extinguished. Her drawings, once vibrant and cheerful, took on a darker tone. The colorful rainbows and smiling suns were replaced with stark, scribbled figures in gray and black, houses with no doors and small, lonely faces with teardrops falling from their eyes. Sarah tried to talk to her. "Honey, is everything okay at school? Did something happen?" Lily would just shake her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Is everything okay with Clara? Do you still have fun with her?" Lily would only offer a quiet, non-committal yes, but her voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. The parents were growing increasingly worried. They took her to a pediatrician, who found nothing physically wrong. They considered a child therapist, feeling a growing sense of helplessness. What was happening to their daughter? They ran through every possibility. A problem at school? A scary movie she might have accidentally seen? Nothing made sense. The one constant, the one recurring element in the timeline of Lily's changing behavior was Clara. But how could that be? Clara was sweet, gentle, and responsible. They had seen her with Lily. She was nothing but attentive and caring. To suspect her felt absurd, almost like a betrayal. One evening, after a particularly difficult day with a withdrawn and anxious Lily, David decided to check the footage from the small security camera they had in the living room. A nanny cam they had installed when Lily was an infant and had largely forgotten about. They hadn't told Clara it was there, not out of suspicion, but simply because it had become part of the furniture. David scrolled back through the recordings from the previous afternoon when Clara had been babysitting. He and Sarah watched the screen, their hearts pounding with a mixture of guilt and dread. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Clara and Lily played a board game. They read a book. But then, as Lily settled down to draw at the small table, Clara's behavior shifted. She pulled out her laptop and placed it on the coffee table. For the next 2 hours, she was completely absorbed by it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes locked on the screen with an unnerving intensity. She barely looked up at Lily, who was trying to show her a drawing. Clara would just nod absently, her focus entirely elsewhere. It wasn't abusive. It wasn't neglect in the traditional sense. But it was odd. The level of her concentration was absolute, almost obsessive. What could be so important on that laptop that it consumed her entire attention while she was supposed to be caring for their child? A new uncomfortable seed of doubt was planted. This wasn't the engaged, cheerful babysitter they thought they knew. This was someone else entirely. David and Sarah decided they had to let her go. They couldn't pinpoint anything truly wrong, but a parent's intuition is a powerful force. The unease they felt was too strong to ignore. The next day, Sarah called Clara and told her, as gently as she could, that their circumstances had changed and they wouldn't be needing her services anymore. She offered a generous severance, thanked her for her time, and tried to keep the conversation brief and professional. Clara's reaction on the phone was strange. She wasn't angry or upset. She was quiet for a moment and then simply said, "Okay, I understand." But there was an edge to her voice, a flicker of something Sarah couldn't identify. Panic? Disappointment? It was hard to tell. Clara said she would stop by in an hour to pick up her final payment and a textbook she had left behind. When Clara arrived, the atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. She avoided eye contact with Sarah and David, collected her check, and grabbed her book. She seemed flustered, in a desperate hurry to leave. She practically ran out the door, fumbling with her keys before getting into her car and speeding away. The whole exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, leaving the Millers feeling more confused than ever. It was only later that evening, as Sarah was cleaning the living room, that she saw it. Tucked down the side of the sofa cushions was a slim, silver laptop. Clara's laptop. In her haste, she had forgotten it. Sarah's first instinct was to call her, to tell her to come back and get it. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over Clara's contact number. But then she paused. David walked into the room and saw the laptop in her hands. He knew what she was thinking. The same thought was circling in his own mind. The footage of Clara staring at that screen with such intensity. Lily's strange behavior. The unanswered questions. The laptop felt like a key. A key to a door they were terrified to open. "We can't," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to David. "It's an invasion of her privacy." "I know," David replied, his voice low. "But what if there's something on there, Sarah? Something that explains what's happening to Lily? We're her parents. Our job is to protect her. What if we give this back and we never find out? What if something is seriously wrong?" They stood in silence for a long time, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Every moral fiber told them it was wrong, but the fierce, primal instinct to protect their child was screaming louder. Finally, with a deep breath, Sarah placed the laptop on the coffee table. David sat down beside her, and together they opened it. The screen lit up, displaying a simple, password-protected login screen. Of course, it wouldn't be that easy. They tried a few simple guesses based on what they knew about her. Her birthday, her major, pet names. Nothing worked. Frustration and a strange sense of relief washed over them. Maybe this was a sign. They should just call her and be done with it. But then David noticed something. The username wasn't Clara. It was E. Vance. Who was E. Vance? Was Clara not even her real name? That single small detail changed everything. The unease they felt morphed into genuine fear. This wasn't just an overly focused college student anymore. This was a person using a false name in their home with their daughter. Their moral debate was over. David, who had some tech experience from his work, spent the next hour running basic password recovery tools he found online. To their astonishment, one of them worked. The password was a complex string of letters and numbers, something they never would have guessed, but the software bypassed it. They were in. The desktop was clean, almost sterile. There were only a few folders labeled with generic names like University Work and Photos. They clicked on University Work first. It was filled with essays and research papers on sociology, just as they would expect. Nothing out of the ordinary. The Photos folder contained a few dozen pictures of landscapes and architecture. No pictures of friends, no family, no selfies. It was strangely impersonal. They felt a bit foolish. Maybe they had overreacted. Maybe E. Vance was a family name or a nickname. They were about to close the laptop when Sarah spotted a small, inconspicuous icon on the taskbar. It was for a journaling application. Her heart skipped a beat. She clicked it open. The journal was filled with hundreds of entries dating back over a year. The most recent ones were from the day before. They began to read, and the world as they knew it began to tilt on its axis. The entries were not the diary of a normal college student. They were meticulous, detailed logs. Subject: D shows increased signs of stress, pacing, short-tempered. With subject S. Observed subject L. She is bright, trusting. It is a liability in this environment. Gained access to the lower level. No findings. The workshop is always locked. Key must be kept on person at all times. The Millers stared at the screen in horror. Subject D, Subject S, Subject L, David, Sarah, Lily. She had been studying them, documenting their every move, their moods, their habits. It was a cold clinical surveillance log. Who was this person? What did she want? Was she a journalist? A private investigator? Was she planning something? The vague fear they had felt now had a terrifyingly sharp focus. Their perfect babysitter was a spy who had infiltrated their home. David picked up his phone, his hands shaking, and dialed 911. He explained the situation to the dispatcher in a strained, hushed voice, trying not to let the panic overwhelm him. He told them about the laptop, the fake name, the journal entries. Within 20 minutes, 2 police officers were at their door. The initial officers who responded were professional but reserved. They listened to David and Sarah's frantic story, their expressions unreadable. To them, it was a strange situation, but without a clear crime, their hands were tied. They took the laptop as evidence and filed a report, but they advised the Millers that it could be anything from a misunderstanding to a bizarre prank. They promised a detective from the cybercrimes unit would look into it. The next few days were agonizing. The Millers lived in a state of suspended fear, jumping at every noise, scrutinizing every car that passed their house. They kept Lily home from school, telling her they were having a special family vacation at home. They felt like prisoners in their own house, a house that no longer felt safe. They called the police station every day, but the answer was always the same. The investigation is ongoing. The case landed on the desk of Detective Miles Corbin, a veteran of the force with 20 years of experience and a healthy dose of cynicism. He'd seen his share of panicked parents and domestic disputes that turned out to be nothing. He read the initial report and skimmed the Millers' statement. A babysitter with a weird journal. It was strange, but it wasn't a smoking gun. He figured it was probably a creative writing student with an overactive imagination. He sent the laptop down to the forensics lab with a low-priority request. The first report that came back was underwhelming. The tech confirmed the journal entries, but a surface-level scan of the hard drive revealed nothing else. No threatening emails, no criminal communications, no illegal downloads. The user, who went by Clara but whose login was E. Vance, had a clean digital footprint. It looked like a dead end. Detective Miles was ready to close the case, to call the Millers and tell them it was likely just a bizarre but harmless incident. But something nagged at him. The clinical tone of the journal entries, the locked workshop, the meticulous observation. It felt purposeful. It didn't feel like fiction. On a hunch, he called the forensics tech, a young genius named Ben, and asked him to do a deep dive. "Scrub it clean, Ben," he said. "I want to know what's been deleted. I want to see what's hiding underneath." That's when the real story began to emerge. Ben worked for 2 full days, peeling back the digital layers of the laptop. He found that the operating system had been reinstalled multiple times. The user had employed sophisticated software to wipe files, to cover their tracks. But Ben was better. He started recovering fragments of deleted data, ghosts of information that had been intentionally buried. He found remnants of search histories that were far from a typical. Students, searches for cold case, evidence, statute of limitations for obstruction, and how to bypass home security systems. He found fragments of encrypted chat logs with a single anonymous user discussing research and dead ends. And then he found the motherlode, buried in a hidden partition on the hard drive, protected by a level of encryption that took him hours to crack, was a single, massive file. It wasn't a journal. It was a case file, a private, obsessive, and brilliantly detailed investigation into a 10-year-old cold case, the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl named Jessica Vance. Detective Miles read the file on his monitor, his cynicism melting away, replaced by a growing sense of awe and shock. The file contained everything. Police reports, autopsy details that were never released to the public, witness statements, and hundreds of pages of original research. There were maps, timelines, and complex social network diagrams connecting dozens of people from a small town 200 miles away. The creator of this file had reinvestigated the entire case from scratch. And the creator, Miles now understood, was E. Vance. Emily Vance. Jessica's older sister. Suddenly, Clara was no longer a creepy babysitter. She was a woman on a mission born from a decade of grief and unanswered questions. The police had given up on her sister's case years ago, but she never had. For years, she had dedicated her life to finding the truth, teaching herself forensics, criminal profiling, and data analysis. The laptop wasn't just a computer. It was her entire investigation, her life's work. But that left the most important question unanswered. What did any of this have to do with the Millers? Miles kept reading, his eyes scanning the file for a connection. And then he found it. In a section labeled Secondary Persons of Interest, there was a name, David Miller. 10 years ago, David Miller had been a 19-year-old college freshman, living in the same town where Jessica Vance disappeared. He was never a suspect, never even officially questioned. His name appeared only once deep in the original case file, mentioned in passing by a witness who said they saw him near the park where Jessica was last seen. It was a loose thread, a dead end that the original investigators had ignored, but Emily Vance hadn't ignored it. She had pulled on that thread until it led her somewhere. Her research showed that David had abruptly dropped out of college a week after Jessica vanished, moving across the country and cutting off contact with most of his old friends. It was a small detail, but it was suspicious. For years, Emily had tried to find a way to get close to him, to learn if he knew anything. When she discovered he had a young daughter and was looking for a babysitter, she saw her chance. The whole thing was a calculated, high-stakes deception. She had created a new identity, Clara, forged references, and tailored her resume to be the perfect candidate. Her goal was never to harm Lily. Her goal was to get inside that house, to observe David, to search for any clue, any slip-up, any piece of evidence that might finally solve the puzzle of what happened to her sister. The locked workshop in the basement she mentioned in her journal, she suspected David might be hiding something there. Detective Miles leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The entire case had been turned upside down. The victim was the investigator, and the complainant was now a person of interest in a decade-old disappearance. He finally understood what was happening with Lily. Emily, in her desperation, had been subtly probing the little girl for information. She hadn't been malicious, but her questions would have been deeply confusing and frightening to a 6-year-old. The dark drawings, the nightmares about a sad girl, it all made sense. Emily had likely shown Lily a picture of her missing sister, Jessica asking if she had ever seen her before, or if her daddy had any pictures of other little girls. She was planting seeds of fear in the child's mind. Not out of cruelty, but out of a single-minded obsession with the truth. Lily was an innocent casualty in Emily's private war. The next step was clear. The police brought Emily Vance in for questioning. She walked in not as Clara, the shy college student, but as herself, a sharp, intelligent, and fiercely determined woman. She didn't deny anything. She calmly and methodically laid out her entire investigation for Detective Miles, using the contents of her own laptop as evidence against David Miller. She explained that she had reached a dead end and was planning her next move when the Millers fired her, causing her to panic and flee, accidentally leaving behind the one thing that connected all the pieces. She told them she believed David Miller didn't act alone, but that he was a witness, a terrified teenager who saw something he shouldn't have and had been running from it ever since. Her evidence was circumstantial, but it was compelling. Far more compelling than anything the original police investigation had ever produced. Armed with a new warrant based on Emily's meticulous research, Detective Miles and his team went back to the Millers' house. This time, they weren't there to comfort worried parents. They were there to execute a search. Sarah was bewildered, her world crumbling around her as officers fanned out through the home she thought was a sanctuary. David was pale and silent, his confident demeanor gone, replaced by the look of a man who had been caught. The search focused on the basement and the locked workshop. For hours they found nothing. The workshop contained nothing more than woodworking tools and half-finished projects. Miles began to think Emily's theory, as brilliant as it was wrong. But then, a young officer searching an old, dusty crawl space under the stairs called out. Tucked away in the far back corner, inside a rotting cardboard box filled with old college textbooks, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was engraved with a single initial, J. When Detective Miles presented the locket to David Miller, the man finally broke. The carefully constructed facade he had maintained for a decade shattered into a million pieces. The story that came pouring out was not one of a monster, but of a coward. On that day 10 years ago, David and his high school friend, a troubled older boy from a notorious family, had been at the park. They saw Jessica Vance. David's friend, on a dark impulse, lured the little girl away. David followed, telling himself he would intervene, but he was scared. He watched from a distance as his friend took her into the woods. He heard a scream, and then silence. His friend came back alone, threatening David with his life if he ever said a word. The locket had fallen on the ground, and in a daze, David had picked it up. He ran home, packed a bag, and disappeared from his own life, haunted by what he had seen and what he had failed to do. His friend, the real perpetrator, had died in a car crash 2 years later, taking the secret to his grave. David Miller was arrested not for murder, but for obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact, and the concealment of a crime. He had allowed a family to suffer for a decade, all to protect himself from a ghost. In the end, Emily Vance got the truth she had fought so hard for. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for. There would be no dramatic courtroom confession from the man who took her sister. But it was an answer. It was closure. The shadows that had haunted her family for 10 years finally had a name and a story. She had done what the entire police force couldn't. She had found her sister. The Millers' perfect life was destroyed. Sarah was left to pick up the pieces, to explain to a confused little girl why her father was gone, to grapple with the fact that the man she loved had built their entire life on a foundation of terrible secrets. And it all came to light because of a babysitter's laptop, a digital archive of one woman's unwavering quest for justice. It serves as a chilling reminder that the past is never truly buried. Sometimes it's just sleeping, waiting for the right person to come along and double-click. Thank you for joining me in the archives tonight. The stories we keep here are a testament to the complexities of the human heart and the shadows that often lurk just beneath the surface of our ordinary lives. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing and returning for our next entry. Until then, be well and remember to look closely. The most important truths are often the ones hidden in plain sight.